So, very welcome to you all. Good to have you here. I was going to say we have some people calling in as well, but we have a few. So today we're going to dive into a world of cross-disciplinary science, methods and possibilities. We have a great lineup of speakers that will help us through this afternoon, sharing their knowledge and experiences. Oops, I didn't do a good impression there. Anyway, so you're probably wondering why, or maybe not wondering, but Future Food is organizing this afternoon, and I am the program director there. I have also with me Pernilla Jonsson, who is a program secretary, and our communicator, Gunilla Leffler. So if you have any questions, more of a practical character, you are free to just come to us. So why do then Future Food organize a day like this? Oops. Okay. Well, our vision is that we want to create a sustainable food system, and we want to contribute to that. And we think that in order to do so, we need to look at very complex questions and really, really complex problems. And to do that, one way could be to work more cross-disciplinary. So we're trying to explore this area in many different directions and angles. So what do we do then? This is just an example of it, but it is we want to show all of you what you do, and also to show the world of what SLU is doing from a research-wise, so make you visible. We also want to make areas where you can meet up and actually build up your network or enlarge your network. And also to create knowledge, and that is one of the reasons for being here today, to learn more about methods and learn from others' experiences. And then also, of course, we want to give you an opportunity to do this, so we have funding opportunities, and I will come back to that in the end of the day. So the program, I will just go through it very briefly, is to start with this, why we do this. Why could cross-disciplinary work or research be of interest to you? So a little bit about why and what is something that Karin Beland Lindahl from Luleå Technical University will talk about. And then the rest of the program will talk more about how we can do this. So we have Line Gordon here from the Stockholm Resilience Center talking about how they do it, sharing their experiences. And we will also have Erik Fahlbeck from SLU talking about the view that SLU has on this. We know that they are, putting a lot of money into the future platforms, for example, and one of our ambition and aims is to work across disciplines. And we will then have an opportunity to talk with the whole panel, and they will be the three speakers, as well as two of our colleagues from joining in also from university here. And then, of course, how to move on. I will give you some examples of what we can do. And then we have an opportunity to meet up and network with others at the university and also outside the university, working with food and research outside here, starting at 4:30. And we're also launching our podcast, so I hope you stay for that. That was very brief about the aim and the ambition with this afternoon. So I'd like to leave the floor and to give that to Karin, please.
Thank you. Just start this. Yes. So thank you very much, and I'll just say a few words about myself, where I'm coming from, before we start. So I'm at the Unit of Political Science at Luleå University of Technology. So today I would label myself as a political scientist. But actually, I have an undergraduate education in biology. So I've sort of done that trip through the disciplines, and I've worked, and still do, work in several cross-disciplinary projects. Where's the thing? The thing we need here? Thank you. So there is an increasing interest and demand for cross-disciplinary research. I guess that's why we're all here. But when we discuss cross-disciplinary research, it's often not totally clear what kind of disciplinary crossing that we're actually talking about, why, and when and how we want to do this. So what I'm going to try to do is to unpack this idea of cross-disciplinarity in 4 different steps. So I'll first talk about why do we see this call for cross-disciplinarity at this time? What is cross-disciplinarity? What different kinds exist? What to use? What kind of approach should be used and when? And then I will finish with drawing a little bit on my own experience and talk about common pitfalls and success factors. So, yes, why do we see this call for cross-disciplinary research now? Well, actually, the debate about what kind of research that suits society is not new at all. I mean, there's been a long-standing criticism of science and why science is moving in the direction of increased specialization, increased fragmentation. So that's gone on for more or less the entire 20th century. It's not new at all. In recent decades, cross-disciplinarity has been motivated by demands for relevance and applicability. Society wants research that's useful, okay? And this has been particularly evident in, for instance, industry-related fields. So an additional driver has then been the recognition of environmental problems, which have been characterized by complexity, non-linearity, uncertainty, and on top of that, the realization that contemporary futures are marked by a lot of uncertainty. This is something you all know about. So all these trends together have sort of driven an increasing call for different kinds of cross-disciplinary researches. But it's important to realize that demands for knowledge vary, and the demands for knowledge reflect societal needs and the public debate. And that's probably why we see these calls now. So to make this a little bit more tangible, I'll take an example from the Swedish forest debate. So in the middle of the 20th century, for instance, I think there was nobody who seriously questioned the authority of the forester. And most of the forest research was carried out by foresters, and it focused on forest production. So then, if we move to the 1980s or 1990s, we saw the environmental movement that grew and an increasing public debate which actually criticized the then production-oriented forestry. So accordingly, ecological forest research expanded during the 90s. Forest ecologists were asked to provide facts and figures that actually could give the ideas of threatened species, threatened biodiversity, sort of a face. If we move even further, so these conflicts that we could see during the 80s, they triggered change. For instance, forest certification was introduced. Some of you may know about it. And that meant that the debate expanded even more. So now it wasn't only production and environment, but a whole lot of people and a whole lot of values and needs that were actually going to get along together in the forest. So who were then to decide what the forest actually were going to be used for? That was sort of key issues in the beginning of the 20th century, when then social science stepped in to the scene. So social science, forest-related science, has increased a lot during the last decades. And with that, issues of power, democracy, governance, and all of those kind of issues. And if we then look at the last 10 years, it's the climate that's been in focus. How are the forests affected by climate change? And how can forests contribute to mitigation? Preferably while maintaining biodiversity, while providing recreation opportunities, while providing reindeer fodder, for instance. So an issue that's at the center of attention at this time is really how to handle conflicts, how to handle conflicting demands in an increasingly complex systems where different dimensions of this system interact with each other. So one answer to this challenge has been new kind of knowledge, cross-disciplinary and participatory research in order to handle this kind of complex problems. So I think it's important to realize that cross-disciplinarity hasn't surfaced as a goal in itself. It isn't maybe a goal in itself, but it has evolved as a mean to handle complex societal problems in a new and maybe better way. So I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. Okay, so with that background, what is cross-disciplinarity? And already in the introduction here, you could see, lots of terms coming up. There is this plethora of terms to denote various kinds of research integration across various kinds of boundaries. So it's cross-disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, multi-disciplinarity, transdisciplinarity. So I'll try to bring some order into this. So all of it is about crossing disciplinary boundaries in one way or the other. So that then brings us to the important question, what is a discipline? Well, I think that we would all agree on that it's some kind of division of labor, right? We have, for instance, political scientists. We do research on issues that's related to politics using our theories and methods. We have biologists. They're researching questions which are related to ecosystem and biology using their kinds of methods and theories. But that's not enough. It's not only about a division of labor. It's also about different organizations or organizational, cultural, and social settings. At least in most universities, the political scientists sit in one house, maybe together, as in our case, with historians, economists, legal scholars. We're in one house. Across campus, there we have the research that's doing technical research, or ecology. So it's not only about the division of labor, it's also about different organizations which mold different cultures, okay? So within these different rooms, you mold your own little culture, you talk to each other in different ways. So we would say, as a social scientist, I would say then that it's also about formal and informal rules. We would call it institutions, okay? But it's about both formal and informal rules. We do different things in our different disciplinary settings, in our different disciplinary rules. For instance, there are different formal rules about what a thesis is supposed to look like if you do it in one discipline and compare it with another. But there are also informal rules, like how are you supposed to behave? How are you supposed to present? What is science? What's unscientific? That's the kind of informal rules that actually sets the boundaries for what the discipline is. So crossing disciplines is much more than walking from the political science house unit to the department where the technicians work. It's about crossing disciplinary boundaries, which involve what I would call institutional change. That means it involves breaking rules and crafting new ones. That's the difficult thing, and it often takes time. So, following Malin Mobjörk, and I really like her way of trying to sort out the different cross-disciplinary directions, I use the term cross-disciplinarity as a kind of umbrella term to denote all kinds of approaches which involves crossing disciplinary boundaries. So she identifies three main approaches: multi-disciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. And she argues that in order to differentiate between these approaches in a sensible way, three dimensions, you need to look at three different dimensions. And they are the one to the left here. So that's the motive. I mean, why do we do this research? What's the aim with it? The scope of collaboration, who's involved? And the integrative approach. What level of integration do we aim for at what stage in the research process? And I'll come back to this term. But these dimensions and her way of differentiating between them emerge from the view that just looking at integration, which is a common way of looking at cross-disciplinarity, is actually insufficient. And a key question is, what ought to be integrated, by whom, and at what stage in the research process? Are you with me there? Good. So I'm going to use this scheme then to move a little bit deeper into the differences between these different approaches: multidisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and transdisciplinarity. So in the left column here, you can see the three differentiating dimensions that I was talking about. So I'll start by explaining a little bit more what we mean with them. So motives. In the literature about cross-disciplinarity, you typically differentiate between, let's say, short-term instrumental objectives, problem solving. We want to do research because we want to solve a particular, very concrete problem and come up with a solution. And we are happy if that doesn't take a very, very long time, right? But the other way, the other motive is what's called critical motives. Okay, critical motives in this context has nothing to do with criticism, but that implies doing research in new ways. So we're doing, for instance, cross-disciplinary or interdisciplinary research because we want to produce knowledge in a new way. We may want to integrate knowledge production in new ways. We may want to involve new kind of actors in knowledge production. But then a motive is really not only to solve a particular problem, but really to learn and develop new ways of knowledge production because we think that they are important to handle complex problems, for instance. Okay? So that's the two kinds of motives. Then we have collaboration between researchers. And collaboration between researchers, that basically is about what kind of researchers are involved from different disciplines. But we also speak about collaboration with practitioners. So that means collaboration not only with researchers coming from different disciplines, but also collaboration between academic research and non-academic actors. That may be companies, or it may be indigenous peoples, or whatever. Okay? And the last point here is integration. And integration is about blending, right? Crossing the boundaries. So multidisciplinarity then is characterized by collaboration between researchers from different disciplines investigating a specific problem, but usually from their own perspective. So they bring with them their own methods, their own theories, etc., and they investigate the problem using their own conventional methods, but then the results are synthesized together, usually in the end of the research project. Okay, so that's multidisciplinarity. Then integration usually takes place in the end, and usually the motives behind multidisciplinary projects are instrumental. So, you bring in different expertise, put them together in order to solve a particular problem. Okay? So, next then, interdisciplinarity. That's characterized by collaboration between researchers from various disciplines, just as the multidisciplinary approach, but with a distinction that this research project is jointly established and integrated from the start to the end. So in an interdisciplinary approach, that's actually required that the different researchers do not only look at the problems from their particular perspective, but they come together and they develop a joint integrated problem formulation and a joint integrated sort of research framework. So the motive here can be instrumental, but it can also, or often is, I would say, in interdisciplinary approaches, also driven by critical motives to do research in new integrated ways. And in this approach then, integration takes place from the start. It's not something that only comes in the end. And in transdisciplinarity, this research process is extended to include participation from various academic disciplines, as in the two earlier approaches, but also from actors outside of academia. So also in this approach, the degree of integration is essential. You're supposed to have integration from the start to the end. But it's actually the forms of collaboration that's really placed at the center of attention here. So in this approach, participation by non-academic actor is required. If non-academic actors aren't involved, it's not a transdisciplinarity approach. Then it's an interdisciplinarity approach. Okay? So some authors also differentiate between, depending on how the non-academic actors are involved, between what's called consultative transdisciplinary research. That's when the non-academic actors are brought in, they're consulted, and they're asked to respond to what the researchers are doing. But they can also, you can also have participatory approaches. And in participatory transdisciplinary approaches, the non-academic actors are brought in on equal footing as the researchers, okay? So they are also part of really developing the framework, of developing the research process. The aims can, in this approach, can in theory be both instrumental and critical, but if you put in all the effort to do this, you usually have a critical motive. So what we need to be aware of is that as we move right in this scheme, in that direction, right, the degree of integration increases, right? But also the range of people to be integrated also increases. And the time and resources that's needed to achieve this definitely increase. Okay? And this is really important to be aware of. We also need to be aware of that the idea to use, for instance, far-reaching transdisciplinary approaches, for instance, then to deliver short-term instrumental objectives, that's in a way a contradiction in terms. If we are aware, if we agree that doing, transdisciplinary research, which requires a high degree of integration, which requires both openness and it requires time, that's not always compatible with actually doing, let's say, multidisciplinary research for short-term instrumental objectives. Because if you're going to deliver something short-term and something very concrete, you can't be completely open and you can't work for a very, very long time. Okay? You're with me there? Good. So how then? Integration is a central element in all of the approaches I've discussed so far. But as we said, it can occur at various stages and levels of the research process, and it can result from various forms of interaction between the researchers or between researchers and practitioners. But whatever approach we choose, this integration doesn't happen automatically. It just doesn't happen because we sit in the same room and we say, now we're going to do something cross-disciplinary. No. So it actually requires a degree of sharing and blending. It requires some kind of common language, some kind of common understanding, because otherwise we actually can't really talk to each other. If researchers or researchers and practitioners are to develop some kind of common framework, some kind of common language, if this blending is actually sharing and blending, if that's going to take place, they have to cross different kind of boundaries. So that requires active work, and in the literature, that's called boundary work, okay? So boundary work is the active work that we need to do to achieve this blending and sharing. One type of boundary work is to develop so-called boundary concepts. Okay, so what's that then? Well, boundary concept is kind of, let's say, trading zones. Okay, can be seen as a trading zone. So you go in there with what you have, you compare and trade, and you can get out again. So the concepts that are open enough to sort of be able so that everybody can buy into them, but they still allow that kind of flexibility. So sustainable development, I would say, is a very good example of a boundary concept, right? Everybody wants it, and everybody has different interpretations of what it means, okay? So it's a good boundary concept. Boundary settings, that refers to the organizational and institutional conditions that foster development of boundary concepts. Well, in other words, that's sort of the requirements, the spaces that needs to exist for people to meet, to actually develop, to do this work, to do the sharing and blending. So cross-disciplinary workshops or courses, or like the event where we are today, that's a typical boundary setting. What we need to be aware of is that integration of concepts, methods, and ways of doing research, that's nothing that we can see in isolation from the organization, structure, and setting of a program or project. If we really want integration to take place, then we have to organize it in such a way that there are lots of boundary settings, right? Where boundary work can actually take place. Okay, so now I've introduced these different kinds of cross-disciplinary approaches. But what then? When are we supposed to use the first, the second, or the third? And can I say something about which one is best? That's the common question. Well, I'll try to touch on these issues by taking a more sort of hands-on example. So what I would say is that what's best, or what's suitable, that really depends on the research question or the research problem. What is it that you want to achieve? What is it that you want to solve? And in addition to that, the available time and resources. Okay? So let's look at this hands-on example. This is a piece of a mountain area, and really the overarching question is, how can this be managed to maintain values and to handle conflicts? Because there are different actors in here that want to do different things with this piece of land. Okay, so if our ambition is to investigate social and ecological impacts, for instance, of a new management system, Okay, we want to investigate what are the social impacts, what are the ecological impacts, and then we want to analyze these different impacts. Basically analyze multiple parameters. Well, if that's what we want to do, a multidisciplinary approach. Remember, where different disciplinary research look at things with their own methods, with their own theories and whatever, is probably the most suitable. If, on the other hand, what we want to do is to analyze accumulated system effects of climate change in this landscape. And we want to know, we want to analyze, a complex system in an integrated ways. We want to know not only how different parameters one by one, sort of what kind of effects they have in this landscape, but we want to look at the cumulative effects of different parameters and how they interact. Okay? Then we probably need interdisciplinary research approaches. We need to integrate our problem formulation. We need to integrate our research tools. We need to integrate our synthesis. Okay? If, instead, what we want to do is to produce new kinds of knowledge, new kinds and new adaptive management systems, and in this case, we're really, really interested to integrate also the traditional knowledge, for instance, of the indigenous Sami people that lives in this area. We think that it's first really important to involve them, and secondly, that knowledge may actually contribute with something. So we want to handle these complex problems with all its uncertainties, and most importantly, we want to involve the people, non-academic actors who actually use and inhabit this landscape. Well, then transdisciplinary research approaches are what we really need to do. But it's really important to be aware of that there isn't a standard approach to the question, what's best? It's a question, what's most suitable in relation to my question or my aim, and the amount of time and resources that I have available. Because if I only have like 2 years for doing this, and I don't have, lots of people who can help me to arrange meetings with local actors in the mountains, I should definitely not choose this approach. But on the other hand, if I do have the time, resources available, fine. Go ahead. Okay. So then, common pitfalls and success factors. Well, if you would go into the literature about cross-disciplinarity, and I think that's actually a very good recommendation to do, before you start any cross-disciplinary efforts, you'll find long lists of common pitfalls and success factors. Okay, so I'm not even going to try to summarize that. So what I'm doing here, this list here is based on my own experience. So I've been part of quite many different cross-disciplinary projects, large consortiums, small projects where we only were like 4 researchers with different disciplinary backgrounds. But there's some things that sort of keep coming back. So they are the ones that I've listed here. So there's some challenges that I've experienced, at least, in several projects. And that's, conflicting knowledge traditions. It's a problem of incompatible motives or goals, which I've already touched on a little bit, and unbalance. So I'll start by actually talk a little bit more about these, and also what can be done about them. And then I'll come back to the success factors. So if we start with knowledge traditions, and just the idea of knowledge traditions may be alien to those of you who are not social scientists, but as we already said, to be able to talk to each other, and even better to understand each other, you sort of have to be able to in some way talk about similar things, or at least not to talk across each other. And to be able to talk to each other in a good way is not so easy if you actually come from completely different knowledge tradition. And a knowledge tradition, that's something that you learn in your discipline. Okay, it's not something that you're born with, but it's something that you learn in your discipline. So the example that I'm going to give here, that comes from a research program which you may be aware of, Future Forest, that I was part of for quite a long time. So that was a collaboration between foresters, ecologists, and social scientists. And now I'll generalize a bit about these different groups of people, but nevertheless, when this program started, these groups of people were supposed to start to talk to each other about what we were actually going to do. And typically then, we had the foresters. So they came in there as problem solvers. They really wanted to resolve or solve what they perceived as a problem that had often something to do with forest management, or more specifically with forest production. Okay, so they had very instrumental goals, and they were interested in forest production. So then we had the ecologists. And the ecologists came in with a quite different idea about why they were doing research. They were not necessarily there to resolve a particular problem. They were often curiosity-driven. They wanted to, understand an ecosystem. And to the extent that they wanted to resolve a problem, it was definitely not how to grow more trees quicker and faster. But it was about conservation, maintaining biodiversity, and contributing to nature conservation. And they were interested in studying nature for its own sake. So then we had the social scientists. And the social scientists kind of took a helicopter view of, saw the forest as a social, as a political, as a cultural arena, including the ecologists and the foresters. So the social scientists, they focused on question like how knowledge was linked to power. They could see power everywhere. And they offered, of course, their analysis of power everywhere to the foresters and the ecologists, who quite quickly were quite fed up with hearing more about power. And a key question here was really how to relate to politics and normativity. And with normativity, I mean specific agendas or even political agendas. So the foresters, they really thought that the political scientists, they were political because they talked about politics. Okay? They talked about politics and power, so they were political. The ecologists, they thought that the foresters were political and normative because they, at least in the view of the ecologists, were pushing a particular agenda to grow more trees. And the social scientists basically argued that both the ecologists and the foresters were political and normative, but they weren't aware of it. And they didn't even make an effort to reflect about it. Okay, so this was a quite unhappy marriage to a start. But Future Forest went on for 8 years, and I think that after the first program period, the first 4 years, things really changed. Actually, this slide that I'm showing here, it's not my own slide. It's Alan Morals, who was part of this program. He's a historian. So when things started to go better, that's when the participants could start to reflect about their own views, their own roles. And this slide was actually presented by Alan at one of our workshops where we tried to sort out what actually was the problem. But many times later on, when we again got stuck in these knowledge traditions, we refer to it. Remember Alan's slide? Now you're sort of, retreating into your typical forester position, or now we get really fed up with the social scientists because they're analyzing all of us all the time. So what can you do about this? Well, as I said, this situation, overcoming different knowledge traditions, requires boundary work. You need more boundary settings so they can do more boundary work. You need to build awareness. And here, bridge builders, like Erland in this case, are really important. People who can take this perspective and offer an analysis of what's actually going on in the room. But another critical factor for resolving this is time. This is nothing that you can overcome in one-day workshop. Future Forest went on for 8 years, and I think it was actually when it stopped in the end, when, we were first able to seriously integrate what we were doing. So my second point here is about motives and goals, whether all goals are compatible. And if we go back to, remember, I talked about Morbjörk's differentiation between instrumental and critical objectives. So one of her points, which I also addressed, is that it may be actually difficult to combine short-term instrumental objectives with long-term critical objectives within the same project. Okay? Because if you have short-term instrumental objectives, firstly, in a way, the goal is set before, those who you want to bring in have even been brought into on board. And secondly, you have time frames which you really need to honor. Whereas if you want to do critical research, you really need that kind of openness, because whoever you bring in need time to be part of defining what we're actually going to do here and how and why. Okay? So this is again from Future Forest. So let's go back and look, what were the goals and objectives of this program as it started? This is from the first project period. Well, so the first goal was to develop state-of-the-art disciplinary science that can feed into cross-disciplinary scenario analysis. Okay, so it's not only that we're going to do cross-disciplinary science here, we're actually going to do state-of-the-art disciplinary science. Okay, so that's to start with. Second, we are to generate insights applicable to management and problem solving. I mean, that's a very instrumental objective. They were even more specified then. So really, one objective was to quite quickly generate insights, tools, solutions. And in a big program like that, it's not like, there you have also stakeholders and funders who are actually waiting out there to get their management tools, to get their solutions. So this is what I would call the short-term instrumental objectives. But then the goal was also to bridge or merge disciplines. Wow, that's a quite far-reaching critical objective, right? That's not done in 2 years or 3 years. To develop new forms of integrated knowledge. Oh, that's another really critical objective, right? It's new forms of integrated knowledge. That also requires at least interdisciplinary approaches, as we talked about earlier. So then we have the last one, to involve practitioners in the research process and enhance collaboration between society and academia. So now we're deep into transdisciplinary science. So this program in its first program period really spanned the entire table that I just showed you. So what we can see here is, and we discussed this later in the program, that there were really, in a way, incompatible motives and goals, which did cause some problems, because that inhibited this openness, both intellectual and procedural openness that is needed to actually reach these long-term critical goals. So what to do about this? Well, of course, the best thing to do is to, when you work out a project or you work out a program, try to make sure that your aims and goals are compatible. And if they're not, well, then you may have to prioritize either the critical objectives or the instrumental objectives. I think it's very difficult, at least within a limited time frame, to do both at the same time. Yeah, okay, there you have it. There are a lot of goals here. Unbalance. That's another common problem that I've experienced in many cross-disciplinary settings. And unbalance can be of many different ways. It can be an unbalanced representation of disciplines. For instance, there is this one cross-disciplinary project that I'm involved with right now. It's about mining and mineral exploration and politics. So it's like, I think about 60 geologists or mining engineers. It's one political scientist and one sociologist. Oh, great. unbalanced representation of non-academic actors. That's another problem. So you bring in non-academic actors, but maybe it's like, okay, so 3-4 non-academic actors and a whole audience of researchers. That's also unbalanced. Or there is unbalance between different kinds of non-academic actors. I think very common, for instance, in the many projects that I've been part of. So you involve those who are most easy to involve. Okay, so that's the companies, the businesses, the organized interests. So suddenly there may be an environmental NGO or a Sami reindeer herding community representative, and they find themselves, as being a complete minority in among representatives of business, industry, government, authorities, or whatever. That's also unbalanced. But there may also be unequal roles of different research groups or disciplines within the same setting. Something that I've often heard and also experienced is, for instance, that in a setting where the natural scientists are in a majority, there is often or sometimes a tendency to bring in a few social scientists as sort of problem solvers. So the natural scientists, they are to show how things are, and then you bring in the social scientists to fix, communication with the rest of society, which may not agree totally with all the solutions that the natural scientists have produced. And I'm a little bit provocative, but I think that this is actually not too uncommon. But I should also say that I've actually been part of projects that have the other kind of unbalance. We've been a large group of social scientists, and the natural scientists have had a very hard time to find their role and to find also maybe a space for their way of communicating and doing research. So this can play out in different directions. Then it's also unequal participation, for instance, in terms of some timing, and that, for instance, when are the different actors brought into the process? And this is actually a tricky one, because most of the time you need to apply for money. And you may not be able actually to go out there and invite everybody before you have the money. So in some sense, you're often forced actually to lay out the project, its goals and objectives, and see if you get the money. And then go, for instance, to the stakeholders who are supposed to be part of it. But then you need to deal with that, because that's not an ideal situation. So what can you do to avoid these pitfalls? Well, actually, this is something that one can be aware of as you start up projects, as you start applications. And if, that wasn't possible, I think one way to deal with it is to adjust the ambitions. So, for instance, in the project with the 60 mining and geology engineers, and it's me and one more sociologist, what we do that? Well, we do not have the ambition to sort of integrate everything in this consortium. We lower our ambition. We were quite happy if we can contribute with our part, and then that may or may not be picked up by the rest of the consortium. But that's a start. So success factors then. Well, I've already touched on what you should not be doing. So if you do those things, that's, of course, success factors. But beyond that, my own experience is that some of the most important, if I think about, what projects, what settings have I been involved with, would actually have worked out fine. What's been the contributing factors? I think personal skills and relationships are really important. And with personal skills, then, I mean, of course, for instance, experience of having worked cross-disciplinary before, but it's not only there. It can also be other kinds of skills. Skills of actually being curious about what's going on, on the other side. Communication skills. These are things that some people have and some people may not have them. You can also develop them. Personal relationships. If I look back now, I can see what are, for instance, the cross-disciplinary papers that I'm proud of. Well, that's papers that we have developed in smaller groups of researchers, which I've worked with for quite some time, and where we have fun. Okay? So this is also important. You have relationships. There are always people, in other disciplines, which you somehow just click with. And you think it's fun. And you're curious. on each other's, and you can draw from each other's experiences, and then it works. So I think a success factor is really to nurture those relationships. But also, as you enter into projects, try to do it together with people whom you actually like to work with, and people who are curious on working in a cross-disciplinary setting, who want to do it. It'll never work with people who are dragged into it, who are not interested, and don't have the drive. Time is another essential factor. As I said, when things really started to work in Future Forest, that was after 8 years. Because in order to develop these personal relationships, in order to do all this boundary work that's necessary, at least if you want to work, in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary approach, that takes time. Leadership is another point. I mean, it's often assumed that doing cross-disciplinary science is something that we just know how to do. So if we just get together, it's going to sort out itself. It's not. It's a skill. It's something that requires experience. So leadership by people who have those skills, who are have done it before, or who know the literature, that's actually an asset. That'll help. So, to wrap up, I think that the potential benefits of successful cross-disciplinarity research, they're quite obvious, okay? We don't need to talk about them. But the barriers to realization, they're not always as apparent. And I don't say this to discourage anybody from doing it, but it's just that when you enter into it, one has to be aware of what it actually takes. But different approaches exist, and really, some are more demanding than others. Pick what's suitable. The more far-reaching ambitions on integration and collaboration, the more time, effort, and resources are needed. So keep this in mind. And when it comes to actually selecting what kind of approach do I want to work with, what approach should I work with, it's the research questions, what you want to achieve, that actually has to guide. And in addition to that, the available time and resources that you have. So finally, there are some key questions that can be posed to every new cross-disciplinary project, kind of checklist in a way. So all the aims, are they compatible? And then there's really two issues that you need to care about: the intellectual space and the objectives. Are the forms for collaboration appropriate? Do they match the aims? And do they match the resources that you have available? Conceptual and methodological integration, as we said earlier, doesn't happen by itself. So, do you have the available time and resources to support what you really want to do? And then again, you have to come back to the question, how much integration is appropriate, how much integration is efficient, given the question and the aim that you want to do. Thank you very much. So good luck with your cross-disciplinary efforts, and thank you.
Any questions? I thought I was going to give you the mic, but it may not work. Everything is still in shop, or? Yes.
I've got a question. What if one person is able to do geology, is able to do sociology, and is also a politician? What do you call that? Is it cross-disciplinary if one person is doing a project and covering all the areas?
When one person can cover all these different disciplinary areas, if that is cross-disciplinarity or if that's transdisciplinarity?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, that comes back to actually first how these three persons want to work together. So if these three persons look into the specific problems using their own theories, their own disciplinary backgrounds, They work one by one, and then they meet in the end to synthesize their findings. Then it's multi-disciplinarity. Okay? So it's cross-disciplinarity, yes. But then it's multi-disciplinarity. If instead these three persons get together already from the start and they say, how are we going to do this? Now we want to develop a joint problem formulation, a joint research agenda, and then we want to do this integrated from start to end. Then it's interdisciplinarity. And if this, let's see, what you had the geologist and the...
I'm saying, let's say one person does courses in geology, does courses in political science, does courses in sociology. And this one person knows all these things. What do you call that? Yeah.
What I would call it, if you do courses in all... then I would say you definitely have, to extent anyway, a cross-disciplinary background, right? But what you're doing, what I would call, if you're doing research then, what we would call that depends actually on how you would do it. I think that's a quite hypothetical situation, because at least you can't, it's very difficult to be a politician and a researcher at the same time. So I would rule out transdisciplinarity anyway, because and I would say that all kinds of cross-disciplinary science is something that you do together. I would say, let's see what Lina says about that, yeah. But you definitely have a cross-disciplinary background, and you bring with you cross-disciplinary skills.
Any more questions? Can I just, I'm very practical, so I keep wondering, you're always pushing, you need time to do this. So from a very practical perspective, when you're applying for funding, do you get enough money to do this type of work?
No, well, depends. Depends on what kind of money that you can get. For instance, a project like Future Forest was very fortunate because it got MISTRA funding for 8 years. So then I would say yes, that was sufficient time. But if you apply for money at the, let's say, Formas or whatever, it's 3 years projects, that's not well, it depends on what your starting point is. It's definitely enough to do cross-disciplinary science together with people whom you worked with before. I do that. Or to, maybe build up consortiums or new partnerships with also people who have that experience and to some extent know each other. But it's not enough time to start from scratch, to sort of build that relationship, to do all the kind of boundary work that's needed to understand each other. That's not enough time, I would say. So, but what you of course can do is to, you can join forces if you have different projects, which also, if you've done one project, you can apply for another, and that's how people often do. So you stay with your consortium in a way. If you have a group of people which you work great with, you will go different places and apply for money, and so you can actually continue to work together for a longer period of time.
Excellent, thank you very much. We will have time to talk more with you later on this afternoon. So I will leave the floor then to Lina Gordon, who's going to share some experience that she has from Stockholm Resilience Centre.
Thank you. This is on, right? Okay, good. Thanks a lot for inviting me here. I think future food is such an attractive name that I want to come here just because of the name, basically, because when I think about some of the pressing issues that we're facing in terms of both sustainability, but also on how to live a good life on this planet, food is really at the core of what we have to think about and at the core of the type of solutions that we need to find. So for everyone in here who are doing food-related research, I think you're in you're moving into such an exciting area right now. When I was putting together this presentation, I was first thinking that, I'll just take things that I've talked about before and then I mash it together. And then I realized that I haven't really talked about how we do things at Stockholm Resilience Center before. I've always thought about what we do and the type of questions we address, etc., but not so much about the process. And part of me also realized that I've never really been so interested in the process, because I've always been interested in finding the pressing issues we need to answer, finding the way to answer that and do it in a rigorous way with good science behind it. And of course, to do that, you need to be working in a transdisciplinary or multi-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, or whatever it's called, way. And I think we're all trying to, at the Stockholm Resilience, we're all trying to do that. But I've never sort of focused so much on the details of these things. So this was quite interesting also to put together, because I think we do have quite a lot of lessons learned, and I want to share those with you and then see if we can have a discussion around it. But then I also realized, was it transdisciplinary the right concept even here or not? But let's come back to that later and just have that as a starting point. We definitely do work transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary and all of these things in order to answer questions around how to achieve a biosphere-based, or how to do biosphere-based sustainability science. So I think our starting point in all the work that we do at SRC is really thinking about that people are part of this biosphere. It might seem natural, but it's not always natural if you think about how we're actually addressing a lot of the challenges in society. But that we're part of the biosphere, and currently we really reshape it substantially, both at a very local scale and at the global scale at large. And at the same time, we as humans are fundamentally dependent on the capacity of this biosphere to sustain us in our development into the future. So the work, this is really at the core of all the work we do. I realized that since I'm going to talk about how we do transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary science, I just want to say a few things about what is SRC first. So maybe I'll spend the first 5-10 minutes of talking about just the organization. And then we get into the rest that I'm supposed to talk about. Now I can't even say the word, you see. So but just some basic facts and figures. We were launched in 2007. We started as the largest investment that Mistra has done in environmental research in Sweden. So we got a 12-year funding, 190 million in total from Mistra. So 12 plus 2007, you can see where we add up. And then that it's a crucial time right now where we're at with the Stockholm Resilience Center. But we existed then for almost 12 years. SRC is a joint initiative between Stockholm University and the Beijer Institute of Ecological, it's spelled wrong here, Economics at the Royal Institute, the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences. We're located under the Faculty of Natural Sciences at Stockholm University. When we started, we were located straight under the Vice-Chancellor of the university. So we got the very special status, being outside the whole sort of faculty structures, and we're also therefore able to have a very interdisciplinary platform at the university. But the Stockholm University has only two big faculties, basically, or big areas, and that's the areas of the humanities, including law and social science, and the area of natural sciences. And they couldn't maintain sort of this weird little structure outside of that, the faculties. So we ended up, after a lot of discussions, under the natural science faculty. which means that positions and PhD programs, etc., has to go through the natural faculty, and all our PhD students, for example, has to have some type of natural science background, at least a year in natural sciences before starting. But we have really been trying to also have it open also for more social sciences, etc. We have built SRC as a place that has staff under one roof. There are lots of platforms that's more like umbrella organizations, so staff is under different departments, etc. But most of our staff is employed at SRC, and we sit in the same house. Right now, we're around 90 researchers, and that includes somewhere around 10 to 15 postdocs and 20 to 25 PhD students. We also have quite a big group working with either communication or policy work or some type of secretariat functions. So we, for example, have 2 larger SIDA projects, and they coordinate funding, proposals, and work in practice in different locations around the world. That's not only research, but it's evidence-based kind of action. So there are people just working as sort of heads of those secretariats at our organization. Then a support and admin team around 10 people. We also have a master program that we take in 18 students every year. That's sort of the size. So even we have quite a lot of emphasis on this policy and communications, but science is really at the core of everything that we do. And we're primarily an academic organization. We organize ourselves in research themes and research streams. So we have 3 themes, and they have more of a place-based focus, either on marine systems, on urban systems, or on landscapes. And crossing them are streams that are a bit more cross-cutting. So these are, at least at the moment, resilient science for transformation. How can we use the science on resilience for actually having societal transformation? The patterns on the Anthropocene. What are the large-scale patterns that we see coming up now at a very human-dominated planet? And can we understand them in new ways? Biosphere stewardship. How can people become better stewards of our planet? And that's both at very global and very local scales. And then we have one stream that focuses more on the fundamental theories and concepts around advancing complex adaptive systems and resilience thinking. These themes are led, each theme is led by somewhere between 2 and 4 researchers, and you're not employed in a theme, but you can pick a theme to work with. And the themes mainly act as kind of attractors for work. So the theme leaders, one of their big tasks is to mobilize people into interesting new projects, which can be difficult because that's about getting people to invest their time into some new area of research. Rather than, we have funding for something particular, we employ you to do something. But so the theme leaders really have to be these leaders to mobilize people to get interest in these areas. But so far it's worked really well, and there's lots of activities along the lines of these themes. We also work a lot with influence on society through interactions with policy, business, and civil society. Just a few different examples, and these are just examples of all the activities. But we founded an organization called the EAT Foundation, together with the Stordalen Foundation and Wellcome Trust. And EAT Foundation brings together science around health, food, and sustainability, but also mobilize actions between research, business, and policy. And it's at the very international scale. Every year there's a food forum in Stockholm, bringing together the international sort of expertise in these areas in Stockholm. We have three actually different programs funded by SIDA, working with some of the biggest development actors and how they can take on resilient science in their practice, but also working with practical applications on the ground, especially around biodiversity and ecosystem management. We're just starting up a new executive education program where we got around 20 CEOs of large companies in Sweden to take a course in transformative business leadership for a prosperous planet. So they're starting just in early November, but that's also a way to mobilize key leaders in society around sustainability issues. I wanted to mention this program because I think it's very interesting also program that is quite transdisciplinary, and it's called CBOS, Keystone Actors for Biosphere Stewardship of the Oceans. And this project actually started as a very curiosity-driven study about understanding these patterns of the Anthropocene. So it was Henrik Österblom, who's the guy here in the blue shirt. He was interested in, can we think about actors in society as keystone species? So keystone species in ecology is species that are few in abundance, but has a very large impact on the system. So if we think about how we're changing the patterns on this planet, are there different types of actors that are few in abundance but have a very large influence on society? And he studied the oceans and looked at the companies that fish from the oceans. And they mapped out all the companies and their revenues and the fish stock they took up. And they found that there's 13 companies that stand for up to 40% of all the revenues coming up from the world's fisheries. So they published that study, and you could think about that as a sort of a scientific endeavor just to understand the system and the patterns of it. But they didn't want to just stay with that finding. They actually started lobbying on the CEOs of these companies to get them around the table, because they had the hypothesis that if we can get them, the top CEOs of these companies, to collaborate, we can actually move. We can use them as a leverage to fast forward sort of a sustainability. So they invited them to dialogues, and we've now had 3 workshops with 10 of these fishing companies, with the CEOs committed to make change happening and move towards biosphere stewardship. And there has been multiple publications about this, both in terms of the basic science. There was one publication recently around how the ownership of patents, and that there's one company globally that owns 49% of all the patents. But there's also been publications on the process of this initiative. So I think it's a quite interesting transdisciplinary effort on a very global scale. So this is really about sort of scientists also starting to act more as change makers. We work quite a bit also with art and science, because I think it's some of the issues that we're addressing are very complicated. So how do you visualize that and talk about it in a way that's compelling and interesting? Just some examples. So here's a sculpture, and it was a workshop that we co-organized together with the Latin American Institute in Uruguay. And they invited artists and scientists to talk about sustainability issues. And there was one Norwegian artist there. And when she heard about sort of this conceptual figure that I think most of you might have seen, where you have sort of the economy in the center, and then you have the society around it, and then the biosphere around that, kind of saying that the economy is part of the society is part of the biosphere, and they don't exist independent of each other. She got really inspired, and she built this sculpture. So this is kind of the economy. It's made out of money. There's a society, and there's a biosphere. And what she said was striking to her when she built this was how you can cut the cord to the economy, the rest will still exist. You can cut the cord to the society, the biosphere will still exist. But if you cut the cords to the biosphere, it all falls down, basically. Up on the top is Andrew Murray. He published a paper on the future of the oceans, and he worked together with Simon Stålhage, who's an artist making futuristic work. And this is sort of exploring how the future can look like in different trajectories. So they both made this art and they published papers around it. And here's another project with Svensk 10, I think, but where they interpreted some of the research coming out of the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics. I feel like I'm talking too much. I'm going to get into the science. But we also have quite a bit of education, not so much at the undergraduate level, but we have a master program, a PhD program, and the PhD program is very transdisciplinary, so I'm going to come back to that. We also have tested a bit of massive online open courses, so we've developed 2 different ones of them. And we're now exploring more of this education that's outside of the academic world, so more with business leaders, etc., that I mentioned before. So that's a little bit of a flavor of what we do at SRC. So how have we then worked with transdisciplinary research? That was the main question. And I would say that in all our work, as I said before, it's really framed around this Anthropocene era where humans are changing the planet so much that we really need to understand how the planet works in new ways. I think the Keystone Atlas is a good example of that. What are the new patterns that emerge that we can only understand also if we bridge between different types of knowledge? But I would say sometimes when we think about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, I think we often think about it as being more applied science. But I think it really has this axis of fundamental science to very applied projects. And we try to work across that whole gradient and spend quite a bit of time on this really curiosity-driven fundamental research, but that is also transdisciplinary. It is also, for us, it's also very important with the capacity and the willingness to take on really complex challenges. And it has to do with some type of fearlessness of, jumping out and addressing new things that people haven't worked with before. So we also work a lot with an organization that can support people who are more fearless. I'll come back to that. But the Anthropocene kind of set in that context. I think a lot of our work is really question-driven rather than capacity-driven. And then I took this quote from Albert Einstein, but it, of course, turned out it's not actually Einstein, but I still think it's a good quote. If I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solutions. I would say that most of us actually spend a lot of time getting to the right research question. And I think that's also important in most of transdisciplinary work, especially when you then have people from different backgrounds, to allow that time to foster foster the capacity to get to the right question. And then you can think about what are skills. Do we have the right skills in this group? Do we need to bring in others? Do we need to collaborate with someone else to be able to answer this question? But that's, lots of time about that. I think we also have quite a lot of publications that are a little bit hypothesis generation rather than just answering hypotheses. So I think often as a scientist we start with a good hypothesis and then we try to answer it, or sometimes we start with a method we have, and then we get to a hypothesis by which we can answer it. But we really spend that time on the research questions. I think that's also important. Another thing I think is I call it framed creativity and encouragement of pluralism. There's so much knowledge out there and so much perspectives, etc., that we can use and come in with. We've had very charismatic leaders of our organization in the founders that started SRC, Carl Folke and Johan Rockström. And Carl Falk has been our science director, and he said from the very start that we need a clear framework to work in. So we have something that always brings our very disparate projects together. And these are the 4 aspects that he put forward and have really pushed in everyone's research. First, we should consider humans as part of the biosphere, which is kind of what I said earlier, but I think it's important to reiterate it. That we're really working with intertwined social and ecological systems, or people and nature. We don't work with just people or just nature, but really where they come together and meet. That we always pay attention to cross-scale interactions, because in the world we live in right now, there is hardly any place that's just local. It's influenced by lots of processes on a much larger scale. The same, if we're going to understand the global scale, we need to get sort of insights from a lot of different local case studies. And then we use a complex adaptive systems approach in terms of understanding systems as non-linear, with potential threshold effects in them, and adaptiveness and learning, etc. So that's also fundamental. So if we work with that, then we can allow lots of pluralism. And this is, I got this from a colleague just the other day, but a little bit of where he tried to put together how we work. And he suggested, if you get to the research question, how to get there, we come with some type of social ecological systems research as a basis in most people at SRC. But that includes theories on resilience thinking, on ecosystem stewardship, of governance, of transformation theory, etc. It also includes a understanding of real-world problems, and I would actually put the arrow between the other research field also into research questions. And then you get to the research question, and then there's also plenty of different methods to that we can use in different combinations, depending on what the question is. And then we designed different sort of study area and cases. And from them we can then learn about how the real world really works, and that can then influence again our research question. And from that we also learn and revise the theories and approaches that we're using, etc., into an interactive kind of dance between theory and practice, or empiricism. So number 4 of the different things that we use in our transdisciplinary work is to really think about science excellence as being at the core. Because I think I think this has been really important. When we started also in 2007, and especially before that, there has always been quite a bit of criticism about to transdisciplinarity also, because there is a risk that it's too fluffy. And it's very hard to evaluate. I mean, how do you actually evaluate a thesis then, maybe, for example, that is quite, that bridges many disciplines? If you don't have one discipline to evaluate it against. And I think we've always felt that we have to protect this space of working interdisciplinary. And one way of doing it is to show that we can produce excellent science. So how do you do that? I mean, for us, I think both showing that we produce in publications and in journals that has very different backgrounds and that we can sort of reach very different audiences has been important. Another thing is that we have also monitored bibliometry quite well, and I'm not going to go into details, but we've always made, there's also a lot of people sort of questioning bibliometry, and I think you should, but I think it also is one way of evaluating the science. And for us, it's been very important to be able to show that we can publish in good journals, even if we do transdisciplinary work. We can get lots of influence of our work in the scientific community. And that's been sort of a way also to protect our space when people are questioning whether this is good science or not. So that's maybe something to think about in transdisciplinary work. We've also worked a lot with international partners. We have a large international network, and most of the projects that we work with have quite a lot of international scholars involved also. So building a good international network has also been very important for maintaining the quality of the science. Primarily, I guess that's been one of the reasons, and also to be able to bring in different types of skills also in the projects that we have. And then, of course, you always need to think carefully about how to evaluate the work that you're doing. And when it comes to sort of career aspects of that, we do have, for our PhD students, most of the committees are interdisciplinary, where we have committee members from different fields. And when people are evaluated for docents or professorships, they're often evaluated also by different people from different backgrounds. Okay, so I have some time. Number 5 is the role of epistemological, I don't know how to pronounce it, epistemological agility and methodological groundedness. And this actually comes from a paper produced by quite a few of our PhD students. I think they're 10 or so PhD students and postdocs. They went together and had a paper that came out recently on undisciplinarity in sustainability science. But reflecting on early career pathways for scientists that actually have these more mixed backgrounds. So what they are arguing is that it's important to have a deep grounding, but also to be able to be aware and able to navigate ontological and epistemological differences. And that's what they then call the epistemological agility. And then the ability to navigate existing kind of institutional and organizational spaces and structures. Yes?
I think maybe it would be good if you could explain those 2 words.
Yeah, so, and the social scientists can jump in. But as epistemology is kind of the way that we understand how the world works. And as you pointed to earlier in the previous talk, there's many ways of understanding the world, and often influenced by our different disciplinary backgrounds. So the epistemological agility is being able to kind of navigate that and being agile in sort of understanding that people understand the world in different ways.
So ontology, what is the world? Epistemology, how can we learn about it?
Yes. Yeah, good. That was a good, much more quicker and clearer way to say it. So this, in this paper, they actually added to this other concept that we talked about before, undisciplinarity, which they argue is problem-based, integrative, interactive, emergent, reflexive science, which involves strong forms of collaborations and partnerships. So, so that could be another way of thinking about it, where you think less about the discipline that there are disciplines, but more around that there are problems and we need ways of solving them or understanding them. Sometimes when I hear about this, I feel like we're sort of, when we also get into this undisciplinary space, we almost like kids in a candy store. You know, there's so many then ways also of addressing the world and methods of understanding it. So how do we ensure that not every day is a Saturday and we just pick the candy that actually is not the healthiest for understanding our world? And what they argue is that we need then both sort of epistemological agility from low to high, and we need methodological groundedness from low to high. And that there is different spaces here then that where there is risk or opportunities for different of them. So if you have Now let's see, you have a high methodological groundedness but low agility, then you're in this disciplinary immersion. If you have low methodological groundedness but epistemological agility is high, then it's quite uncomfortable. How are you actually going to act, and what tools do you have to understand the world? And then you have the conceptual la-la land, which I think I kind of like that notion, because I think there's a real risk that we end up there if we don't have any groundedness, especially if we don't have any groundedness in any of these aspects. But the basis for really rigorous sustainability science is when we can combine this in a good way. I also like the quote from this paper, which was, my main recommendation would be not to think so much about disciplines, but to think about 2 or 3 things that you're good at, and then make those your profile, and make those your strengths. When we've also thought about, especially kind of how do we develop, especially the younger generation in this space, we think a bit more about these T-shaped professionals, that you have some type of boundary crossing competencies, and that you can understand and communicate across many disciplines and across many systems, but that you also have a depth in some areas. And I don't think it necessarily has to be the discipline, but it has to be in some type of knowledge domain that we get more deeper in. And also being able to analytically think and solve problems in a more deeper sense. So when we think about those, what are the top sort of T skills for people at SRC? One cluster has to do with the practice of transdisciplinarity. So how do we lead, create, and facilitate group works? How do we organize meetings? How do we inspire people to work together? How do we work with non-scientists? How can we both take risks but also listen to critiques? How do we actually make sure that we can triangulate what we're doing? So those are skills that we seldom think about that we need to cultivate in science. Communication is important. Multiple styles, both in terms of scientific papers, but also more in terms of visualization. Passion and hope, and I think you mentioned that also, that we need to have fun, and then there needs to be some type of optimism, especially when working with quite dark problems, sort of. And then transdisciplinary scientific insights, how to identify good questions, how to evaluate quality, how to show respect for other disciplines and perspective, and then knowledge, to really have a methodological toolbox, to have historical understanding, and to have a conceptual breadth. So those are some of the skills that we think are important. We've actually developed quite a lot around what are the core knowledge that our students that do PhD in sustainability should have. And here are the different fields that we think students should have at least some knowledge about. I'm not going to go through them, but that kind of forms the basis of our field as a sort of a discipline or emerging discipline maybe. Then we also develop areas of core skills, core methods, and core code of conduct. And if you look at this, the idea is that a student should know something about all of that, to have awareness of it. Then they should know how to use a few of these things. They don't need to know how to use all of them, but a few of these they should know. And then they should master a few things. You don't have to take the whole, but you should have the awareness of all of this. And I just want to point to this one, because I think that one matters a lot to keeping a good environment for transdisciplinary work. So we actually talk quite a lot about respect, about sharing of ideas and skills, being supporting, being collaborative, being inclusive, and being playful. But then also, of course, you need data analysis skills and so on as well. But I think those, the core of conduct is also important. So that takes us to the last part that I want to mention, and that is around trust and culture. And I just took this quote that I hear in the business world, but culture eats strategy for breakfast, basically saying that it's easy to kind of think about the strategy of an organization, but it's actually the culture that's going to make the difference. So we invest a lot in making sure that we have a fun and nice work environment. We, for example, have an annual staff retreat where we go to Stora Karlsö, which is an island outside of Gotland, and sort of hang out together for 2 days. This cultivates fearlessness, because I think if you are working in this space, you're not going to be the expert that you're maybe used to being as a researcher all the time. You need to also be able to dare sharing ideas, dare sometimes, and getting criticism, etc. And then invest a lot in collaborations and networks and making them fun and stimulating. And then also put up strategic recruitment. So we're not the department, we're a center, and we can recruit staff also in slightly different ways than departments do. And I think that also, we can sometimes put a bit more emphasis on those type of core competencies that I mentioned before, than just how you do how many publications you have or so. I asked a friend of mine, I remembered him giving a talk on our transdisciplinary approaches, and I asked him to send that talk to me because I remembered it being really good. And he sent me all of these metaphorical pictures, but nothing about the content. But I really like this. I think what we're often trying to do is like, here's your comfort zone, and that's where the magic happens. So trying to stimulate people to jump into that area of magic where it's more unexplored ideas. And this is, you also have this one. So you can see it in that way. But then I got a little bit worried because unicorns doesn't exist, and magic, we're actually doing science. But I guess it is about how do we then build rigorous ways of getting to that magic space. So, because I mean, that is a risk also, of course, of transdisciplinarity. So he also gave me this. It's awesome with wings, keep on flying. But sometimes this is actually what lots of people who try to do this type of work feel like. What am I getting myself into? And then I guess what we're trying to do is to make sure that we have the skills and capacity to actually take the dive out of a cliff when we need to in order to answer good problems. So the work culture, just a few more things, but really builds on openly sharing ideas, discussing them in teams with very different knowledges, skills, and disciplinary backgrounds. And this is also uncomfortable for many scientists because when you share ideas, there's also a risk that people are running with them and publishing them before you, etc. So it's really about that, having a good culture of inclusiveness then when you do that. And trust, collaboration, and creativity, as I said. A few other kind of key words, I guess. It's been coming back, but the culture, the administration, we have a fantastic admin team. We're very supportive, and we try to have simple and clear rules about the admin. We also do think quite a bit about what is quality, how can we support each other's quality and learning, etc. So this is just sort of summing up in terms of the things that I think are important for transdisciplinary work from our experience. So, there are costs to this approach. And it takes a lot of time and a lot of collaborations and coordination. And sometimes I can also see people just being spending too much time on just coordination. And there is a risk that you end up in that space. But once it works, you get so much out of it. And it is very difficult with traditional career trajectories. So that's still like a main problem, I would say. I think I kind of mentioned most of this, but yeah, we have research teams with multiple leaders. We have staff under one roof. That was very important for us, that you can work together and learn from each other. A lot of time spent in workshops and meetings. We have staff lunches every Monday where we get the whole staff together, and we spend 40 minutes of speed talks just so people can present what they're working on and share what ideas with us. But they only get 4 minutes, but that gives us sort of an overview of what's going on in the organization. The sort of art and science and music and doing sports together has also been important in the culture. Maybe this is actually where I'm going to end and leave you with this list of things where I think are both risks and benefits of transdisciplinary approaches for future careers. Of course, there are lots of risks with it, and we talked about some, but methodological confusion, loss of focus, difficult to evaluate quality, high cost of coordination, and so on. But there are also lots of benefits when you get it right, in terms of exciting, satisfying work, and really big to advance sustainability science. But that's it for me, and I'm happy to questions or discuss it in the panel later. Thank you.
Thank you, Lina. I think, fika is so important in Sweden, so coffee will be outside. Lina, I think we will have tons of questions for you, but I hope it's okay to leave them for the panel a little bit later on. Mm. Okay. I think coffee is served, now I'm looking at you, just outside. We will be back at 3:10, and then we will have Erik Fallbäck here to talk. Thank you. Tack så jättemycket. Okay, welcome back after a coffee break. I think we lost a few during the break, but it will be more time for the rest of us to discussion. The third speaker is Erik Fallbäck, who will give us the view from SLU's perspective on I better use the correct words now, cross-disciplinary work. We know there are different categories, so go ahead, Erik.
Thanks a lot. You lost a few. I wonder if I'm the reason. Since I did not listen to the definitions of others, I might blur up things a bit. I'll give you. I'm acting as Pro-Vice Chancellor. I mainly work with collaboration with the rest of society. I have some limited experience in interdisciplinary research, and of course I'm heavily involved in discussions on what we do at SLU and why we do what we do. So in English I thought the title could be "What's the point with interdisciplinary research at SLU?" And after some reflections on research, I will say a little bit on my thoughts on interdisciplinary research. And then back to SLU and societal challenges before some concluding remarks. Of course, you're welcome with questions all the way along. And research, of course, it's a huge discussion and literature on what research actually is. Not the least in the philosophy of science or the science of philosophy. But Oxford Dictionary says that the systematic investigation into and study of materials and sources in order to establish facts and reach new conclusions is research. And what you have here is the definition that I took from Wikipedia, and they use OECD and the Frascati Manual to say that research comprises creative and systematic work undertaken to increase the stock of knowledge, including knowledge of humans, culture, and society, and the use of this stock of knowledge to devise new applications. Research is used to establish or confirm facts, reaffirm the results of previous work, solve new or existing problems, support theorems, or develop new theories. And when we look upon different branches of research, we can reflect a bit on this basic definition. Multi-cross, inter and transdisciplinary research. We know by now that the knowledge increase in many ways. The majority of this increase traditionally takes place increasingly in specified disciplines. And mainly incremental increase of the knowledge base. Quite often used to confirm theories, or to reaffirm, or to support theorems already established. And this kind of intra-discipline research is, of course, what also we at SLU have been very, very successful. If we look on the establishment of, or the development of research here at SLU, we have done a tremendous transformation during the later decades. Today we are highly ranked in very many sub-disciplines, very many specified disciplines. And within these disciplines, we of course increase the internal understanding of methods, of concepts, of theories, of methodology, all the time increasingly specified. And it sort of turns into new dialects where you speak not only the same language, actually you speak specific dialects. And they in turn may lead to new languages or sub-disciplines within previous broader streams. And within these disciplines we also develop different ways to understand and describe the world. We're down to ontology and epistemology, which actually differs a lot today in many disciplines, where they can even have a starting point that was common, and then they have over time become quite separate. And this expansion, of course, takes place in sort of any direction. So the amount of knowledge, of course, increases in any direction. And this also increases the need for new combinations, more or less exponentially. So the possibilities to add have become increasingly large and increasingly hard to sort of reach because of the increased distance between previously linked disciplines. And then I've heard that you have had much more in-depth discussions on the various concepts here. So then I will give you some notions from my point of view, and then you can see, oh, he has not understood much. But when I use multidisciplinary research, it's mainly when researchers from different disciplines look at the same kind of question or topic or issue. And if we take cross, it can be used in many different understandings and settings. But one of them is when you, for example, take scientists from one discipline and let them focus on issues that are traditionally done within another discipline. So you sort of cross your methodologies, theories, and languages. Of course, you can also cross in many other ways. And inter is when you work jointly, both in formulating the questions and putting up the research agenda and also doing the research. And if it becomes even more complex and even more ambitious, we can have use the term transdisciplinary to include higher degrees of complexity, more actors, and actually sort of transform the methodologies and theories used. Is that somehow in correlation to what other ones have said previously. Thanks. Then if we go back then, when is this useful? Of course, it's probably more useful if we go back to the definition of research and those dimensions there when we have to put up new questions and solve new problems. So we sort of we increase the potential to go beyond incremental knowledge. And of course, here is also the large challenge, because I spent at least 5 years understanding a theory when I did my PhD. And I was highly stimulated by one specific author. And the first years I was so astonished. How clever. So many nice concepts, and they are unique, and they differ. And actually, they cannot be translated into any other kind of language, because they are so specific. I couldn't even explain them in Swedish, because they were so specific. And then after some years, I started to realize that one strategy for a researcher is to do exactly that. And if that researcher is successful, other ones will start to use those concepts instead of others. And when I had to explain to others, not knowing my topic, what I actually did, we're into translation, we're into understanding different languages, I became better and better in explaining what I previously had not understood. It was rather small differences in the concepts. I could have used other concepts and added a few other things and describe almost the same thing, but not exactly the same thing. And I think this is the major challenge when we try to do trans or even inter and transdisciplinary research. We have to go this way into learning each other's languages. And the starting point at the breakfast table at home, describing what you do, is, I think, very, very useful. Because to do this kind of research good and properly, we need to learn new languages. But we cannot be experts in every language. So we have to cheat in the other languages. And we have to do it good enough to make ourselves understood and to understand. But we cannot expect to learn the nuances and the very deep level. And what at least I found very, very stimulating and fascinating was this very deep understanding of the very specific nuances in my own discipline. And again, that's a challenge. Do I have to give up that kind of award if I am more involved in inter or transdisciplinary research? We can compare, I guess at least we can compare easily success factors for inter or transdisciplinary research to what we know today about preconditions for real innovations. By now we have fairly well understood parts of innovative processes. And we know that we increase the potential for real innovations if we mix and blend different experiences. If we have to confront others, if we get frustrated by others that don't understand what is so specific with what I have, or what I know. And this blend and this frustration and this creative way of having to reorganize your own thoughts to express what you already knew so good to someone else is partly, I guess, success factor also for this kind of research. I tried, I really, in my process, I really got to first be able to understand this basic theory, and then I could even explain it, and in the end I thought I could even use it to some kind of, have some kind of predictive efforts. And this understanding, explaining, and even go beyond that, I think is also here part of the process. If we can merge first the understanding and then turn that into a common explanation, we might even go beyond that. So it's important not to discredit any particular kind of information, rather to seek to creatively confront different orders of data in effort to develop new hypotheses and pose questions that have not yet been asked, as well as answering others that not yet have any reasonable solution. So that's, I think, the major home take for why that kind of, what characterizes that kind of research. SLU. These are the words we use by now when we communicate what SLU is and what we're doing. We're putting science to a test. We're solving real problems, and we're doing that for a thriving world. Another way to describe us is to use the UN goals for sustainable development. We know that all these goals are relevant for SLU, a majority of them directly to what individual researchers and research programs do. And all these challenges, they are characterized by a very high degree of complexity. They cut through traditional scientific disciplines, and all of them involve human behavior if we want to tackle them. Sometimes these are called wicked problems, and what I find interesting, we did an exercise at, I'm involved in a project we have among 8 universities where we try to increase our capacity to understand how collaboration between universities and other ones can help us better tackle these sustainability goals. And we were in Gothenburg on one of these sessions, and we had 8 case studies, and each case study had to choose one of these goals as the most important. You only have to choose one. Oh, but they are all important. All of them are relevant to me. Choose one. And then motivate why you have chosen this one. And what was fascinating, I think we had several different ones. I think one of them was twice. Several different ones. But almost all the motivations was, I have picked number 1, because that sort of summarizes all the other ones the best way. If we solve that one, we have solved all the other ones. Oh, I took number 12 because it's the perfect, if we solve that one, all the rest is solved. That way of reasoning came for almost all of them. So they are interlinked, but still we have to focus on only taking one part of it because we can't grasp all of it. So the complexity here is, of course, tremendous. But it's relevant to what we do at SLU, and it's relevant to how we want to continue to develop our research. As you know, we have had this KON 2018, where researchers from all over the world have come here to help us understand what we do good or what we could improve even more. And what these evaluators recognized is, of course, I would say, that we have very high quality in our research. And we have also high degrees of relevance of our research. And some of them said that we have some kind of golden egg in the combination of excellent research, very good infrastructure, equipment, and well-established and relevant contacts with the rest of society. So they see a huge potential for SLU and SLU researchers to take a more active role in the discussion of the future of society and the grand challenges we have. When we look upon a little bit more in detail in what some of the panels said, this was sort of an overall picture. Of course, we had critique in many areas, but the overall picture was very positive. And what they actually claim, if this golden egg should turn into a golden bird or whatever, we have to release this potential that we have, and that is to a high degree to be much better in interdisciplinary research. One of the panels looking at nature and society, where we have quite a lot of social science, they said, well, we're not that impressed really. When you say that you, in SLU, use the social science in your joint programs, often they are added a little bit afterwards. Sometimes they're used some kind of cover-up because you actually did not take it seriously. So we have a lot of things to still improve, but we have, we think, a great potential. And to become more relevant, we need then to expand our efforts and to actually do more real interdisciplinary research. We know that many of our researchers are successful in publishing and in attracting grants. We know that the societal need for rapid transformative changes is high and probably urgently increasing. And here we have the need for interdisciplinary research. It is recognized here, but also in many other universities. If you go to the major Swedish universities, all of them, I would say, have some kind of initiatives that are similar to our platforms. They have different names, but it's partly the same. Chalmers have areas where they try to combine their disciplines and they add central money to sort of stimulate researchers to get into new combinations. KTH have something similar. Stockholm University, you have your whole group within Stockholm Resilience Center, which is part of the same kind of initiative and effort. We have them in Lund in various forms. So these exist in all major universities. And one of the reasons is, of course, that it's hard to get traditional research funding for interdisciplinary research. That's why, one of the reasons why we add central money to these kind of platforms and these kind of initiatives. And why is that hard? It's partly hard because it takes much more time. I guess you have discussed that already. It takes time to learn languages. It takes time to learn to be a good friend to someone you didn't understand from the beginning. Someone with a totally different worldview. Someone that says, no, that's not an elephant, that's a mouse, or whatever. It takes huge amounts of efforts and time. And we can, as I said, we can never actually learn those languages equally well as other specialists. But we can learn them good enough to at least communicate in a way that is meaningful. So it takes longer time, it's much longer processes, and therefore it's also more challenging to come up with research questions that can be dealt with by traditional panels, because they also have to understand, and they have to understand the specificity of the blended research issue or the blended team or whatever. But I'm convinced that this actually really urgent need for transformative changes at societal level call for solutions that come from interdisciplinary research or transdisciplinary research. So we have to continue stimulate these kind of blendings of our sub-disciplines, and we have to continue to stimulate researchers to join in the efforts. We have to do that because not only it is rewarding when you actually learn a new language, or at least learn to understand it, it's also rewarding because it increases our relevance in society. But what we hope will be the major outcome is more excellent research. And the challenge that it is to undertake this kind of journey also is stimulating and rewarding for us as individuals. We hope to increase the potential for real scientific breakthroughs where we not only incrementally increase the knowledge, where we actually break totally new ground. So if we are this, then I'm convinced it will make SLU more attractive for potential employees, but also for students. If students realize, wow, there's another result coming from that university that actually makes a difference. And of course, we hope that we will, by being more attractive to those, will continue in a positive spiral, and this will, in the end, result in science for policy, where we can, by doing more interdisciplinary research, also influence science and policy, and be active part of the transformation in society. So these areas are very important for SLU. We hope that the platforms can be part of the stimulation of these kind of processes, and we very much hope that the kind of discussion you have here will spread to your colleagues and make them more curious and more attractive in actually trying some of these hard-working exercises that it is. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Erik. Before we set up the panel, is there a specific question for Erik? You have your chance now. Yes, Karin. You do.
In which way is SLU actually helping in financing? Because when you mentioned all these things that I do recognize very well, working transdisciplinary, I mean, it costs more if you have 4 scientists or 5 or 6 involved. These projects tend to be quite expensive, and you have the future platforms, but do you have some other kind of carrots for us to grip? Because
today,
it is difficult. It is a bit more difficult to get.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, today we don't have any specific programs. We have the point with the platforms is part of this. But at the central level, we don't have a specific program. But I'm convinced there exist initiatives at the level of faculties or at the level of departments.
Karin, we actually consider your Center for Biological Diversity as an investment in cross-disciplinary science, and that's a lot of money. We also have planning grants, but we're struggling with the problem to get things started, and I will ask more about that later here, I think.
Okay. I think I will ask the panel to come up there, and I think you're seated in front here. And I will ask my colleagues Stephanie and Velimir to share some of their background. And sure, do you want this mic or do you want a headset? Do you want to stand over there? Yeah. Yeah, you can. Jag tänkte sätta en så liten grej. Stephanie, do you want to say some words about what you're So Stephanie, if you start over here so that they can follow us, and then you say some words about yourself.
Okay.
And you probably need a mic. Sorry for this.
Does that work? Can you hear me? No?
Is this all working?
Hello?
Oh, yeah.
Hello?
So go ahead.
Can you hear me? Okay, wonderful. Hello, I'm Stefanie Leder. I'm a postdoctoral researcher here at SLU in the Department of Urban and Rural Development. I'm in the Division of Rural Development. And just to give those who are not from SLU the background, the department is the social science unit within SLU. So I'm a cultural geographer by training. My PhD is in cultural geography. My graduate studies were in biology and educational sciences. So I actually was trained to become a high school teacher and then pursued my PhD and left that trace. So I have already quite an interdisciplinary background per se. And after my doctoral studies, which were on the implementation of education for sustainable development in India, in geography education, I pursued a postdoctoral fellowship within a large interdisciplinary research project by the CGIAR, which is called Water, Land, and Ecosystems. So it's basically a thematic approach combining a range of different disciplines, political scientists, anthropologists, irrigation engineers, agronomists in a multitude of different projects, and I was the gender postdoc for that. So I was, without having the background of much feminist research at that time, I was responsible for gender, poverty, and institutions as a cross-cutting research across all fields. So there I was, and I want to give you two examples to highlight what were my learnings during that time of having had more like a social science background myself and trying to collaborate with scientists from mostly more biophysical backgrounds. So I was part of a project called Improving Dry Season Irrigation for Marginal Women and Tenant Farmers in the Eastern Gangetic Plains. That is basically in Nepal and northeastern India. And as it happens, the idea of the project had a very radical transdisciplinary approach. It wanted to test collective farming, which is in a context where there are very fragmented land holdings, there are basically small land holdings by marginal farmers whose husbands, like female farmers, were running them, and husbands migrated into cities. So the idea was to create an approach, and this approach was basically translated very differently by the different stakeholders within the project. So what I noticed is that some looked at it in a very institutional approach, so what were the rules we should establish? Some looked at it at a productivity approach, so how much more crops can we produce? Others looked at a social equity approach. So that was the NGOs working on the ground, having local community approaches and saying we need to strengthen the community. And there was me with a feminist background saying we need a social justice approach. We want to make sure that within these farmer collectives, the diverse individuals are benefiting. So we're not talking only about women and men, we are also talking about young women and old women and young men and old men. And we're also talking about high caste and low caste people, high class and lower class people, depending on the land size in that matter, in that context. So in that context, I was working with an irrigation engineer, highly biophysical background, and we decided to look at gendered technology adoption. And the issue there was to sit together and design a questionnaire together and conduct focus group discussions together to explore who benefits from the irrigation technologies tested out in the project. So in that context, I can relate very much to what many of the speakers have said before. It was a very time-intense project, effort, but very, very rewarding, because I learned a lot more about technologies which before I assumed I already knew. And the other way around, the adoption was seen as a very critical approach suddenly. Before it was the irrigation technologies were delivered and someone was using them, so tick mark, implementation is done. And so that was my point here. It's mostly very time intense, and it does require a common research question, developing together methods, going to the field together, and then afterwards going back with our analysis, our case studies, present them to the farmer communities and ask them for their perspective. Did we understand you correctly? This is transdisciplinary research. You go back and feedback your results, and you don't publish before you have actually received their consent of your research participants. The second aspect I would like to highlight is valuing differently situated knowledges and also questioning what is considered as expert knowledge. And in that case, just a short example, I was put in many projects where I was supposed to evaluate gender or the effect on gender, for example, in a watershed project. And when I asked diverse biophysical scientists what was their understanding about gender within the project, and they said, well, women attended the resource user group meetings, and women are there. Again, the same project, this assumption that women are there in highly patriarchal context that was in Jhansi, in the highly patriarchal belt of India. When women are there, we have conducted gender research or social inclusion. So in that sense, I did qualitative research to complement that, and which was very difficult to find justice for, that I did spend long days in the field, that I needed a lot of time to conduct my research, which could not be done in terms of water flows and household questionnaires to measure which household gets what, because I look within the household who gets what, and within the community who gets what. And in terms of attending the resource user group meetings, I looked into whether the participation was beneficial to women, or whether it was maybe a time burden, or membership fees were a financial burden, or the influence on decision making was very limited. And attending meant just to listen. And in terms of the application of new knowledges and technologies disseminated through project staff, were they actually applicable or valuable? And on a personal level, did women actually feel comfortable to attend these meetings? I think that were the main points, that these different perspectives, as coming from a gender or research background and working very closely with colleagues in biophysical sciences, has been very rewarding and time intense and difficult, and also spending time to communicate this. And as the very last point, the language is also very important. So in this collective farming project, I, from the beginning, argued against one group where landless female laborers were clubbed together with land-owning male farmers. They were clubbed into one group, and I was arguing qualitatively, if you can say so, with a social justice argument. I think they are very unequal power relations, and I think women will not be able to feel comfortable or speak up, and I gave some explanations around that over 2 years, and I was not listened to. And when I was listened to was when I did, after a season, an economic measurement of each individual household, and I could show off that women actually earned less, as if I just remained wage laborers. So I could show that the approach in numbers had a negative outcome. Then I was listened to, then the group was dissolved, and then a new group was formed with female landless laborers. So that's just an example to show that the language is important, and that I also had to position myself or use different means to bring the message. Yeah. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I think we'll have questions to you later on. Vladimir, do you want to say some words as well?
Yes, very shortly. I would like to take so much your time. I am a researcher, associate professor on Department of Ecology, working mostly with plant protection. In base, I'm an agronomist. I'm starting all my life. Wanted to know how the plants can protect each other, protect from different enemies. And the reason I'm starting with plant protection from a plant breeding point of view, did my master degree and starting to be PhD student, moving later to entomology, starting to work, learning more on insects, and finally working back to the ecology, mostly to working in plant ecology. So you can see that my career not was straightforward, and digging deeply in some research is actually would like to do broader research that can be working later on cross-disciplinary, if you can talk that, interdisciplinary. However, my research was also the base later on interesting projects. One of the MISTRA funded project, plant called MISTRA, based more or less of my PhD thesis that we are using how the plant-plant communication fundamental research will be applied as soon as possible. Then we have a very broad number of scientists from different disciplines, and at the same time we have a lot of users. I agree with the first what Lena is that we make many mistakes during this project, especially when you're talking that we didn't realize how much time is important. We didn't realize how language is important, Eric, as you mentioned. We didn't realize on which way we should communicate. And now looking after that quite big project, we should do much better. But we learn a lot of things. We have a lot of experience. And that experience helped me later on to even to go broader to my interest, that I'm very interested in technology, techniques. And that reason I'm jumping to something totally different scientific area. For instance, using different type of imaging techniques to protect the plants, to find diseases or symptoms on the plants. At the same time, using nanotechniques. And all these things, when you're coming with this type of scientists and with type of research areas, we have to learn totally different language. And that is also one of the problems is culture. We have different culture. Many of you have already mentioned that in organizations, in thinking, in preparing, for instance, meetings, and is also totally different. So that I would like to also but I mentioned only now the problems, but there are also many positive things. We learn a lot of what is that each day. That I would like.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. So we got an excellent panel, a huge amount of knowledge here. I thought I didn't let anyone ask you any questions here, Lina, because I was so eager to get to my coffee. So obviously, some of you have questions for Lina about the Stockholm Resilience Center and the approach there. None? Okay. So I thought you would leave some. Maybe you were chatting with everyone during the break. Oh, yeah. Okay, good.
But it depends on when you started at Stockholm Resilience Center. Were you there from the beginning? Yeah. Yes. So what were the first things that happened at the center when you came together, so to speak? What did you do?
But it was, the SSC
as a one project between Stockholm University and especially something called the Center for Transdisciplinary Environmental Research, and then the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics and the Market Institute. So in that sense, we had three markets. So we very early the Bayer Institute, but they were really close anyway. And then I think one of the first things, we had a pretty good match of people and already some ongoing projects. I think one of the first things was the identification of some markets and appointment of team leaders and start working on those things. So that happened quite early and then mobilizing around it.
Okay, I think I understand. Thank you.
So I can't by helping when you said, if I go ahead with asking some questions, you were talking about undisciplinary approach, and obviously I was like caught in because you talked about all these disciplines. If you could comment on that or, elaborate a little bit on it. You missed the morning, Eric, sorry.
An undisciplinary approach. First, I would like to say that, okay, so what I offered is one approach to sort of try to systematize the different approaches. You can use different, but I think that the approach that Malin Mobjörk has worked out, it has some merits because it's systematic, and I agree with her about looking, the importance of the different dimensions. So in that sense, I think it's productive. You can do something with it. An undisciplinary approach. I think that completely depends on what you actually mean with an undisciplinary approach and whether, here I think there are also different personal preferences. I'm actually quite fond of, I think there are ways to, because there's also been other people here talking about depth and, do you have to give up your disciplinary belonging and your depth and whatever. No, I'm actually quite fond of combining disciplinary and different kinds of cross-disciplinary research. That's what I do myself. And, my own PhD students, I would recommend actually first to get quite solid and to get a solid basis, maybe in one discipline and then to cross over. But this is a matter of taste. Some people do it differently. But that would be my preference. I think there is one risk in what did you call it? An undisciplinary? And that is maybe what you described yourself in your candy shopping approach, that if you're not aware of what's actually exists, where you're coming from, what's already done, about the histories, there is a big risk that you reinvent the wheel, and also that you, in an unrespectful way, which you also brought up, just enter into existing disciplines and sort of, tell them what... I've experienced this myself, because I think it's more common that natural scientists cross over to social scientists than the other way around, for whatever reason. So it has happened quite a few times, that you're very enthusiastic and well-willing and all of that natural scientists, and they come in, and now they've this absolutely wonderful model, and suddenly you see, oh, so you're going to describe society in terms of an ecosystem. Well, fine, but, sorry, there has been quite a few research on this. It's X hundred years of research that's already been done. I don't think it's something particularly wrong in trying to explore society in terms of an ecosystems, but it's good if you at least have an idea of actually what has already been done in social sciences. So that's just an example. So I think fine, but there are some pitfalls, there are some risks with such an approach, I think.
Any comments from you guys on the undisciplinary approach and the risks?
Just one reflection. One of the ways economists understand and describe the world is that you have to give up something if you do something else.
So that was one perfect illustration of how I use my language when I describe things, which may have a totally different meaning for someone else. To me, it's you have to give up something, because that's how the world works. That's my understanding of the world. That's part of my epistemology. So it's a good illustration of what we've been discussing. Otherwise, I agree to much of what you said.
Stephanie has some comments. No, go ahead, Stephanie.
Yeah, I just wanted to add another example how gender scientists have been forced also in communicating more effectively. So what happened is that there has been this index developed called the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. And what it actually does is it measures intra-household decision-making, women against men, and says based on that whether women are empowered in the household. But what happened then, adding qualitative research around this, I have done that and colleagues of mine have done that, showed a very completely different picture. So through the process of trying to quantify something by economists, feminist economists who want to make the point gender is important, qualitative researches were necessary to show that, for example, in context of higher out-migration, that doesn't mean that women are empowered or it's their choice to make decisions. Or in contexts of strong ethnic diversity, Dalit women, which is like the lowest caste in Nepal and India, might be very outspoken, driven by poverty reasons. And high caste women have this purda, this perception of being more preserved and staying away from society, and then decision-making is considered as something negative. And so that is one example where the combination of quantitative and qualitative methods and the crossovers were very necessary within one thematic approach where people actually have the same common goal to highlight gender issues.
But I think it's important to be quite pragmatic sort of in our approaches to any type of cross-boundary things. But we have enormous challenges that we need to solve, and that's something we all agree on. And to be able to do that, we need new approaches, and I think we all agree on that. But I don't think there's one way to do it, but we need many different ways of doing it. So we need all these traditional disciplines. So maybe that's 95% of everyone at university or something. And then we have the 5% that are doing more transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary stuff. And out of those, it's like 1% or 0.5% that's doing the more undisciplinary science or something. But I'm sure that they have a role to play. But obviously not everyone can do that, because then I think we end up in conceptual la-la land sort of very easily. But I think it's important to sort of think about, like, on those margins, what can we cultivate and what are the new things that we can grow? And I also think some of the students that I've been supervising, for example, then I've really been doing that together with more disciplinary scholars. So I had a PhD student who spent 2 of her years in Delft in Holland in a hydrology group, because we needed kind of to build a sort of hydrological model that we then used for understanding land use change impacts on rainfall, which was kind of the aim of that project. But I could see also when she was sitting in Holland, she really got more drawn into more and more details of this model. And we needed a little bit of a simpler model. We didn't need the details, but everyone wanted her to do all the more detailed stuff then. And then she spent the last 2 years with us, and then she could kind of bring her out a little bit again and see how she could build on what she had already done. So it was a good combination of that, the more interdisciplinary environment, and some disciplinary environments.
Benjamin, I think you
yes. Thank you, Karin. You have already answered all my questions that I would like to bring up. Sometimes if you want to work with that, they usually as we mentioned many times, the language is very important, and at the same time, it is important from my point of view, understanding to each other, because if you want to collaborate in that multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, what we call, that doesn't matter. You can label in whatever you want. That usually, I think that each of us has some lecture and homework to try to understand all these other disciplines in some way, learn basic language that we can already from the beginning start to understand to each other in proper way. Second, when we have these type of the meetings, for instance, that is the biggest problem that suddenly is going to very deep is some certain problems that I suddenly realize, am I so stupid? I can't understand that, or did I probably I have to do properly my home lectures, etc., etc. And then suddenly you are feeling that you are not involved in these processes. And I think this is something that we have to already understand from the beginning. And learning these things, usually some of the very experienced, my colleagues are saying, okay, we are doing on that way from the beginning. And then later on we go into the next level and the next level and next level. And finally we find a way to understand to each other. But when it's coming new member, we have to start more or less from the beginning. And that is some processes, take time. And that, as a scientist, we have another problem which would like to bring up here is financial side. We usually have a short 3 years, 5 years, sometimes luckily 8 years projects. But is that enough time to do that? I'm wondering all the time. And probably when we already come into that level to understanding each other, project is finished. And then what's next? And usually that is my I would like to discuss about that with others, because most of us are scientists in some way here.
Thank you. My name is Christina Koch, and I had that question too. If we are going to increase or the transdisciplinarity with the increasing complexity of the world, and it takes time to understand each other's languages, is there a shortcut? Do you have any hands-on tips on when we meet in different groups, new people in different disciplines or different cultures? Are there any questions to discuss, any things we can do to speed up and highlight? Because some people might not even be aware that we speak different languages.
You have the answer, Karin.
Well, I can answer because I think this is a difficult question. But I come back to, first, I think it's a question of what do you really want to do? So, if you don't have a lot of time, so maybe start with a in my then terms, multidisciplinary approach, where you actually look at the same problem, but with your different methodologies, and then you synthesize in the end. Then, yes, you still need to some extent to, understand each other, but to a much lesser extent. So that's one thing. Well, second, I think, if you really then want to move to the levels of higher integration, which requires much more of common language and blending, well, one shortcut is, of course, to do this with people whom you already know and whom you've already worked with together, because then you already have a certain degree of shared language and shared experiences. A third thing, if you don't have those kinds of networks, is to think about, it's much quicker, much easier to share or to learn each other's languages to the extent that you need to if you're a smaller group than if you're a large consortium. So this is a much quicker process in a smaller project consisting of 5 researchers than in, for instance, the Future Forest context, where you had, I don't know how many. And the last one, there are bigger hurdles between certain disciplines than others. So, for instance, to have interdisciplinary project with different disciplines within social sciences. That's much, much easier than, for instance, to build up a group where you have both natural and social scientists. And again, if you do want to do that, I think there's still easier, for instance, to combine researchers maybe that both work in curiosity-driven kind of fields or in ways than, for instance, if you mix disciplines or researchers, for instance, those who are working very close to industry with a very normative agenda and those who come from sort of a postmodern end. That's going to be highly difficult. You see what I mean? So I think there actually are ways to do this more or less difficult. And depending on how large, who you invite, you can to some extent actually steer that.
I'm going to leave it to Stephanie. Just a comment to you. One of the ambitions that we have at the future platforms is, of course, to give possibilities for funding for exploring cross-disciplinary works. Then it all depends on for how long, to what extent, but that is certainly one of the aims that I think all the platforms, future platforms, has in order to be able to, let's say, make it possible, make it happen for the researchers here. So I will come back to that as well.
I wanted to add on that question that I think before we start integrating different knowledges and think of how to collaborate, I think one step before we should try to situate ourselves and give enough in workshops or meetings, enough time to actually explain our traditions, our disciplinary background, what are our types of research questions, methods we would use, and so on. So basically, before actually applying it to a new project idea, I think this situating and trying to, kind of de-hierarchize particular knowledge traditions and showing off the diversity of of knowledges, I think that's very important. And I would do that through very participatory approaches because it can be very intimidating for non-academics to engage with academics in terms of transdisciplinary approaches, or for social scientists or qualitative social scientists to engage with quantitative. I mean, they might often feel like sidelined or not well understood. So I think to find really methods which kind of break the ice and let bonds establish will be time intense but rewarding afterwards. And I think that's a very important thing.
But I think I would definitely start with the problem or the question. So then, of course, the question is who's around the table to determine that question. But I would pick a few key leaders, thought leaders, to sort of get to a question you want to answer. So if it's within the Future of Food program, for example, what's the most innovative and exciting thing that you could address here at SLU that you have sort of a key competitive advantage compared to other places to really address in that whole sphere? And that would be that no one else is working on right now. If you can find like a few of those, and then you'd think, okay, who at the university would be your ideal partners in that, and who has the skills to answer that question, and then bring them into the table. And maybe what would be the ideal international or other national partners also. Then you start having a core group that you would work with. And then you can start addressing like the differences and so on in that room. But start with something that also is exciting and an interesting question that people can gather around. I think that's important for being quicker.
Excellent. Is that a comment to this? Okay.
But Lina, at the university, my experience is that the best projects are bottom-up processes in some way. But you are recommending the other way around a little bit. So how do we reconcile that? We have bottom-up processes right now which have to do with new diseases in forests, drinking water, purity and analysis. These are also sort of at least cross-disciplinary questions. But how can we bring those bottom-up processes to become completely transdisciplinary is something I would like to know.
You would like to know a very easy question to answer. Any short comments to that? Because I have another question that I would like to bring up as well. Okay, gosh. Oh, quick. You haven't said much, Erik. Okay, sorry.
Is this quick? No, but a comment on I think it's a very good question. I think it's highly relevant, Christine, and because many good comments, Lena, from you on tips how to make it easier. But at the bottom line, I hope that we, within the university, believe in learning and believe that we can transform other people's internalized knowledge to other ones. But we have not explored this kind of learning that much yet. And I think it's a high risk trying to be too simplistic. I remember one colleague who made his PhD, and his accomplishments were in fine-tuning sort of a measurement and a model. And then he put it into a one-page comment on what he had done. And anyone who read that would ask, why did he get any money at all? We knew all this from the beginning. It was so simplified that it just lost its meaning for scientists. He had done some contributions, but they were in nuances and details that needs to be understood by heavy work. And then you could simplify it away. Maybe you could kickstart it with some of the recommendations you had, but I think we must realize it takes time.
Okay, since I have the power of the mic now, I like to switch topic. No, but I think a very important one, what you bring up, quite a few of us, and we also had it in the Kuhn evaluation, which has to do with getting out of the comfort zone, stepping out there, being fearless. You were talking about how can we create an environment where our scientists dare to step out of what they feel comfortable in and contributing to a group, and you had some really good illustrations there, and you also brought it up here. So I'd just like to have some, brainstorming. And I will say that Karin will leave us in 3 minutes because she needs to catch a flight, and they won't wait for her. So just some great ideas how we can create some fearless, or this move our scientists towards a little bit out of the comfort zone.
Well, I'm just asking myself, do we really need to do that? Maybe, but I think that a really critical sort of component of getting any kind of, especially transdisciplinary or interdisciplinary project going, comes down to really skilled, energetic, enthusiastic researchers. It's like what we call eldsjälar, in Swedish. You can never, ever get around that. You need money, yes. But really, if I look at the projects, the successful projects I've been part of, comes down actually. It doesn't have to be very many. Okay, maybe it's good if they sort of are bottom up. I'm not even sure that's necessary, because if you're energetic enough, if you have the brilliant ideas, people are going to want to follow you, okay? So with the risk of being a little bit elitistic here, I actually think that finding the right persons is really key. And then nurturing those persons, nurturing their relationships, nurturing their work. And I think if you find the right persons, they're going to be fearless, because that's the kind of persons that you need. Yes, then you can encourage them, and you can, do all the things. I think you had lots of excellent ideas, but I really think that's a key thing. And even here then at SLU, if we speak about how you get started, I think that is my taxi now calling, so sorry. I'm going to have to.
You're a pure eldsål. Thank you for being here, Karin.
Should I continue that?
No, I just want to have some, ideas around how you can create 12 eldsjälar or, all these fearless...
No, but maybe I completely agree with what she said. So I think you need to... eldsjälar, you maybe need to find them and cultivate them. But then you also need to have people who there follow or participate in that type of process. And then I do think trust is a very important part of that, both to share ideas, to dare being a bit stupid, and to be able to have criticism and critical discussions, but not to get stuck in that sort of, but that you can move forward and in a very trusting environment. I think that is very important. I don't know if that's
that's good, Lena. I was hoping for more.
How do you do it?
Just do that, and then you just tee it off, and then we go off. I understand that.
No, but I think you. Sorry. No, but okay. When I did my undergraduate, for example, it was at Stockholm University in biology, and I remember one department we were that had some of our undergrad courses. They used to take all their PhD students out for something they called the blood bath, where they basically spent 2 days and sort of tearing apart their thesis topics and, criticizing them and so on. And I think that is not the way to go if you're kind of building a trusting environment. So, and I think
you gave me an example of what
not to do, but I do think we sometimes sort of used to that as scientists, that like you kind of approach each other with more of the criticism than encouragement. And while we need that critical thinking, we also need the encouragement and sort of cultivating the trust. And exactly how you do that, I think it's difficult to say. But I mean, we've done it partly by having fun together in different types of ways and having sort of nice time together that's not just about the work, but about some other things as well. That's part of the solution. Yeah.
Erik, do you want to give some comments?
On what?
On how we could,
how we can get more people burn for critical issues. Now, I'm.
Was that my question? I don't know.
Eldsjälar, get them on fire. Of course, enthusiasm is a disease that infects others. Of course, so that's one way. But to be more serious, we can, of course, I think resources are highly important, and what Karin said is also important. But to give really bright people that dare go into totally new areas, to give them the time to spend to actually identify these very, very interesting issues is very critical. Otherwise, they will, of course, continue to do what they did yesterday. That's what we usually do. And then we can add resources. And then someone have to choose those that will have that possibility. And I think that's the most tricky part. Of course, we couldn't necessarily say, or Torleif can say, we put up 25 million. The three of you that come up with the best idea, you get the money. But, I mean, then again, we are not trained to sort out what is the best idea in these kind of issues. And then maybe more, now we're trying with the platforms. You're trying with seed money. We would have to try to learn from what we're doing. Maybe we should give a little bit more money or a little bit less money, but more time or whatever, to change, elaborate on it and try to learn on the way.
Stephanie, do you have some bright ideas to share how we could create scientists or groups where they dare to step forward, perhaps into the bit out of their comfort zone?
What we introduced in our department, which has also very different disciplines, is to link budget or funding to requirements on different disciplines from different divisions. And that, I think, they can choose from a range of scientists, but to actually make different disciplines talk to each other, I think that's an incentive to have. Yeah.
Many of previous speakers more or less say very important points, but one of the things that I'm all time wondering is that the problem, what we want to do, which type of the science we would like to do together, who is going to do with us and why they are doing with us. All these questions, when you're putting that on table or on paper, then you're trying to find some structure. How we encourage people to do more or less the same things is depending of if you find people that have the same interest, they would like to be in that part. And then one of the points will be probably to find proper leaders that can probably drive. Usually when we meet into each other, scientists is very, very excited to do this experiment, to do some type of scientist. Suddenly, after a while, that is interest going down. And who is going to bring back people on the table? And that is depending who is the leading the projects. So that is very important that someone is, or few of them, is leading all the processes. And I agree with you when you're talking about bottom-up science. That is very important because the science is working with some problems. They're probably finding, but probably is very close in their research area that they feel very, very comfortable. But at the same time, they realize that solving that small problem, that someone can help, or many people, others. How I can bring that, how I come to the next step, that is very important to identify people, and that is take time. Take time to understand them, to talk with them. So if how you made the gold egg in this, if this person is so have courage to do that and wanted to go to the next step, outside comfortable zone, then we can probably have this disciplinary. So one of the bottom up and top down, and top down is looking usually as financial support. So the giving possibility to give it that in environment, equipment, etc., to do that. So problem from bottom up, but financial support or other support from top down.
I will leave that as the concluding remarks from the panel then. Ideas from bottom and money from the top. I would like to just show a couple of slides concluding the day, but thank you so very much. And I think we should give them, since we're not too many here, so a big applause. Thank you. So you, unless you want to have a look at the audience from that view, you can stay tuned. Talking about creating possibilities, I just want to show you what we can do from our perspective at Future Food, and that is, different kinds of funding, all the way from, pilot studies to interdisciplinary collaborations or seeding money. So if you're interested, check out our website for the possibilities to do it. So not all the way from the top, but a little bit in between there, but there are possibilities.